Looking at our world from a theological perspective. This is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good morning, everyone. It is Friday. Good morning, everyone. It is Friday, May the 28th, 2021. It is currently 8:18 a.m. Central Time, and welcome to Memorial Day weekend for 2021. Now, I have learned over the years that it's probably not always a great idea to do a lot of podcast episodes over Memorial Day weekend or name any other holiday weekend. A lot of times people are traveling and they're just not listening to podcasts. So I kind of debated with myself, do I even go out to the church and do any live broadcasting today? Or do I just say, you know what, let's just take the weekend off. Oh, yes, we'll have church on Sunday and those sermons will be uploaded, but let's not do anything else. But you know, I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. There's too much to talk about. So I got in my car. I've driven here to the sanctuary of Victory Baptist Church. I'm here at Victory Baptist Church, Ovalo, Texas, on this Friday, May the 28th, 2021. Now, I don't know what you're going to be doing this Memorial Day weekend, but whatever you do, be safe. Wherever you go, I hope you have a wonderful time. Even if you're just sitting at home, have a great Memorial Day weekend. And if you are listening to us this weekend, by all means, feel free to you can jump into the live chat, or you can email me at newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. Give me your thoughts, your opinions, ask your questions. And I will do my very best to see what I can do to help you out, answer your questions, or to talk about any subject you want me to talk about. But I think the weekend is about to become, I think we're about to fill up this weekend and what we're going to talk about. I think we are about to enter into a subject that literally we could talk about for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, probably months and months and months. We could probably spend an entire year talking about this, and that is not an exaggeration. That's not hyperbole. I really do believe that this subject, we could go in so many directions with it. But I guess what this will serve is kind of an introduction to this subject, and I am going to be very interested to see what the response is. I'm going to be interested to see how many people, this is the first time they've ever heard anything about this, or how many people are like, no, that's what I believe and you are wrong. It's going to be very interesting. I think we're going to get a lot of different responses, but we will wait and see. Now, before we do anything, I'm going to try to, or when I say, but let me state that again. Before we get to the actual subject, before I do anything with the actual subject, I want to really try to offer an introduction that hopefully will build, and in a sense, the steps that we're going to walk on to get to the subject. We're going to kind of build a pathway to get to the subject itself, and hopefully this is going to make sense. There's going to be a lot of things you need to listen to carefully before we jump in. I know some of you have seen the title and you're like, just go. And no, we're going to go slow. We're going to try to get there, all right? So let me start by just posing a lot of different questions. All right, let me just ask you a lot of different questions, and I really want you to think about these questions because your answer will really determine how you're going to think about this subject. All right, so and I'm just going to ask these a lot of different ways. Maybe it will be somewhat repetitive, but I want to get your thinking. I want to get your thinking. I want to get your mind working. I want to get you thinking in a certain direction. And just to get you thinking before we even jump into the topic. Are you ready? All right, here we go. We got a lot to do. We have a lot to talk about, all right? Here we go. What should Christians do when society increasingly moves away from God and His law? As a Christian, you look around at a world, at a society that is increasingly moving away from God's law, in many cases becoming more and more hostile to it. They are turning from God. They're rejecting God. People are doing whatever is right in their own eyes. They're building their own ideas, their own morality, their own ethics. And what do you do as a Christian? You look around and you see and you're like, man, the world is moving so fast away from God. What are we going to do? What is the solution? How do we look at this? How do we understand this? And I know you may think that Christianity at large would have an agreed upon answer to that, but there isn't an agreed upon answer. First, a lot of times people's view of eschatology comes into play, right? Some people's eschatology says, no, things are going to get worse and worse and worse. Things are not going to get better. And no matter what we do, things are going to get worse ultimately and then depending on how you view it, either the church is raptured out, then 7-year tribulation, then Christ ultimately comes back to set up the millennial kingdom, or you may hold a different form of eschatology, but there is at least some views of eschatology that says things are going to get worse and worse and worse, and that's the way it's going to happen. And no matter what we do, no matter how hard we try, we're not going to be able to stop it or change it. All right. Some people would say, well, yes, when society is getting worse and worse and worse, what we need to do is we need to just focus on preaching the gospel, just preaching the gospel to people. And that if society is ever going to be changed, it will be changed through the preaching of the gospel. When someone embraces the gospel, they repent, they turn to Christ, they are saved. I'm not going to go through the whole order of salvation and get into that whole debate. But when they are saved, then they will then begin to try to pursue God. They will begin to try to follow God, follow Christ. Their mind is going to be changed, and their life is going to ultimately be changed in different ways. And as a result of that, then that person is changed, and the more people who are changed through the preaching of the gospel then could ultimately begin to change society. However, depending on your eschatology, no matter how many people get saved, enough is not going to get saved to stop the ultimate demise and decline of society as more and more people reject it and move away, and apostasy begins to spread. The church becomes a mess. And so even if you do that, you know that it's limited in what you can accomplish, but this view would say that's the commission of the church, to go and preach, and that's what we are to focus on. You preach the gospel. You preach the gospel, you live out your Christian life, and you understand how things are ultimately going to move. So I'll phrase this in two questions. Number one, what should Christians do when society increasingly moves away from God and his law? And then I will say this. Number two, should Christians focus on the preaching of the gospel and living out our Christian faith? So number one, what should Christians do? And a lot of different approaches, a lot of different ideas. And number two, should Christians just focus on the preaching of the gospel and living out our Christian faith? In other words, look, that's just preach the gospel, teach, preach, disciple. That's all we can do. That's all we can do. And not only is that all we can do, that's all we should do. That's the biblical commission. And that's the focus. Or number three, should Christians look to impose the law of God on society? Should the church, the focus become, I'm not saying that this would completely reject the preaching of the gospel, but this third question, and it's kind of this view that I'm trying to articulate with asking this question, even though they may not completely object to preaching of the gospel, the focus seems to be on, look, we're going to call society back to God's law. We're going to vote for bills and try to get politicians, and we're going to look to impose basically the law of God through the passing of laws, and we're going to call the government back to the judicial laws of the Old Testament, that those judicial laws of the Old Testament should be imposed on society through, I guess, governmental force. The government should step in. The government has a responsibility to follow the judicial laws of the Old Testament, impose those laws, and impose the punishments connected with it. Is that the solution? Is that the solution? So look, Christians everywhere can look around and go, man, the world is in a messed up situation. It really is. But should Christians focus basically on the preaching of the gospel and living out the Christian life, or should Christians focus on trying to fix this by somehow imposing the judicial laws of the Old Testament upon society through whatever means, calling politicians to do it, calling government to do it, and saying this is what should be done, and people should be, this is the punishment that should be handed out for them committing this act? How should it be approached? Now, you have your own opinions, you have your own thoughts. I have mine. But we're going to look at a specific way of thinking that many Christians have, and we're going to analyze it. There will be some critique, but we're going to seek to try to understand it. I guess there will be some critique of it, but we're going to at least introduce it and try to understand it, and then we will see where this all leads in future programs. But we have a lot to get to. So let's just define one of the ways that some Christians think is the correct way to deal with a world that is increasingly moving away from God and becoming more and more ungodly, more and more rebellious to the law of God. And this way of thinking, this view, is called theonomy. Theonomy, Theonomy, theonomy. Theonomy. Now, theonomy comes from basically two words: theos, God; nomos, law. All right, God's law. Theonomy is the idea of God's law, and I'm going to just read from a number of different definitions. Here's one. Theonomy, from theos, God; nomos, law, is a hypothetical Christian form of government in which society is ruled by divine law. Now, this describes it as a Christian form of government in which society is ruled by divine law. We take God's divine law, we take God's law, and it is basically, that's how society should be ruled. That's how government should operate. That's how government should operate. Now, how far do you take that? There's lots of questions I would have. So if we're going to be ruled by divine law, then anyone who's deemed an apostate, anyone who's deemed to have false doctrine, should they then be killed? Anyone who's considered a false prophet, should they be killed? Should people be punished, in a sense, for theological crimes? Yes? No? All right. Like, okay. Well, let's leave out theological crimes. Let's forget that. Okay. So, other maybe judicial laws or moral laws. So people who commit adultery, how should they be punished? People who are homosexual, people who are, and we can just go down the list. How should they be handled if we're going to have society, in a sense, ruled by divine law? How much of that divine law are you talking about? How much do you want it imposed? And do you want the same punishments imposed? And even if you accomplish that, what would that look like? What would that I mean, would it be a wonderful thing? I guess some of the ideas, and now remember, whenever we talk about a system like theonomy, there'll be people who hold to theonomy who will say that's not an accurate description. I don't believe it that way. I believe it this way. There's always a million variations in anyone's belief system. So it's all, whenever you talk about something, say like theonomy, let's just make it very clear. There's going to be 50 people who say, nah, I don't look at it that way. I look at it from this perspective. You don't understand theonomy. I'm like, well, you say I don't understand theonomy. And then someone over here says, no, that's a correct understanding, because there's always so many different shades and variations. But the idea is that society should be ruled by divine law. Which divine law? How is it imposed? And even if that occurs, what happens? Now, some would say, well, if society is ruled by divine law, we receive blessings, so that society would be blessed. But my question would be, but that wouldn't make anyone Christian. That wouldn't save anyone. So you'd have unregenerate people living under divine law. How well would that work out? I would say, go pick up your Bible and read the Old Testament about a nation called Israel that was being ruled by divine law. And how did that work out? Because divine law imposed does not change the unregenerate heart. Now, that's something I will stand firm on. All All right. Now, others may say, well, it doesn't matter. If it changes the unregenerate heart, it would still be a blessing for society. Okay. You could go a lot of different directions with this. Theonomists hold that divine law, particularly the judicial laws of the Old Testament, should be observed by modern societies. The precise definition of theonomy is the starting presumption that the Old Covenant judicial laws given to Israel have not been removed or abrogated, or they've not ended. All right. Therefore, all civil governments are morally obligated to enforce them, including the specific penalties. And furthermore, that all civil governments must refrain from coercion in areas where Scripture has not prescribed their intervention. You could recall this the regulative principle of the state. Now, we've talked about the regulative or normative principle in worship. This would be the regulative principle of the state. The state can only do what is precisely laid out in Scripture. That's what government can do. Government can do what Scriptures say, and they can't do what Scriptures does not tell them to do. They are very much regulated by Scripture. Now, I just want you to think about this. If I'm someone who's not saved and I hear someone promoting this kind of thing, I'm telling you, I was like, so you're going to impose your religious laws on my life. And that, you talk about creating hostility, bitterness, and basically a civil war. I think that would bring it about very quickly. Because people would like, wait, what are you talking about? So and what happens when the majority of society doesn't want that? So what is the theonomist? What does those who hold to theonomy would say? Do the people get the right to vote? Or are you saying just override the people's will and impose divine law upon them? Like how do we work that? And again, someone who holds to theonomy would say, no, you're misunderstanding it. You're misrepresenting. I'm not trying to misunderstand or misrepresent anything. I'm trying to ask some basic questions. Right? I think there's some concerns there. Another definition, theonomy is a view of Christian ethics associated with Christian Reconstructionism. Now, there are articles out there saying that don't confuse theonomy with Reconstructionism. And then I've seen articles that can kind of bring the two together. But okay, theonomy is a view of Christian ethics associated with Christian Reconstructionism, most noted for its attempts to show how the ethical standards of the Old Testament are applicable to modern society, including the standing laws of the Old Testament as well as its general ethical principles. So you take the Old Testament and you're like, this is how society should operate. This is how it should operate. In other words, forget Israel, all right? They were for Israel. They are for us. They are for Texas. They are for your state. They are for our country. They are for China. They are for North Korea. It's for every government. This is the way they should operate. They should impose these divine laws upon everyone. All right. Now, I could ask a lot of questions here right now. Like, okay, first of all, is this even, what does this look like from a practical, like how does this impact your efforts, right? To me, it seems you begin to negate, like I don't even know how you impose this. I don't even know how you impose this. I don't even know what you would do. Clearly, it's not going to happen. Clearly, it's not going to happen. By no means is it going to happen, because I believe more and more society is moving away from God, becoming more hostile to the law of God. So you're not going to impose divine law on people. You're not. To me, it's not going to happen. So what? So it's like it almost becomes to me a vain system of thought. Because while you're running around trying to impose it, it's not going to happen. So what do? Do you protest? Do you boycott? Do you picket? Do you try to get everyone to go vote? Do you just rant and rave against the government? And is that what you do? Or to me, that just becomes an exercise in futility. Why wouldn't you just do what I believe scriptures would call us to do, and you go and preach the gospel? And why didn't Jesus or the disciples seem to tell us to impose divine law? I mean, Paul tells us to submit to the government, right? He doesn't say impose divine law upon said government. I don't know, but that's theonomy. Now, why am I bringing all of this up? I am bringing up theonomy today. Well, one, because I think that sometimes as Christians, as we talk to one another, if you're talking to someone who holds to theonomy and you don't, you're talking a completely different language, right? You're never going to come to any agreement because you're using your perspectives are so radically different. So you have to stop and go, wait a minute. So you hold to theonomy. Okay, well, that's the issue. You're running around saying we should be doing this, and this. And I'm looking at you. Why would we do any of those things? Because you think that we need to somehow, God's divine law needs to be imposed upon society. And I'm thinking, no, I'm just going to preach the gospel to people. I'm not trying to impose divine law on anybody. Radically different approaches to everything. So I think a lot of disagreements within Christianity comes down to these deeper theological issues, and we have to understand them. I don't know if theonomy is growing. I don't know if more and more people are becoming people who accept and promote the theonomy view. But it appears, at least according to one podcast, that someone very well known in Reform circles, James White from Alpha and Omega Ministries, he's a part of Apologia Church there in Arizona, that he seems to have embraced theonomy and he's now promoting it, and he would refer to himself as someone who holds to theonomy. Now, I've done a little bit of I heard this last night. Now, maybe this is not the first time I've heard this. Maybe I've heard it before and I just forgot about it and moved on and didn't give it much thought. But I will say this. I've been listening to Dr. James White, it seems like forever. I think I discovered Dr. James White in the 1990s. Have been listening to him forever. I have listened to his debates. I've went to hear him speak in person. I have told everyone else to listen to Dr. James White. So members of my church actually drove all the way to Arizona to attend Phoenix Reformed Baptist Church because they were hoping to sit into a class that Dr. James White was teaching. They drove from Texas to Arizona. So I've had people from my church literally go to Arizona to that. They went with me. I think we went to Dallas to see Dr. James White speak. So so I've been a long-time listener of Dr. James White. I will clearly say, and I think anyone who's listened to him for a long period of time, things have changed with Dr. James White, dramatically changed. He left Phoenix Reformed Baptist Church, went to Apologia. Don't know why, but after that, it just seems like perspective started changing and becoming far more political, and his talk and his speech more political, and at times, especially during the COVID situation and the election, at times, I hate to say this, and maybe this is somewhat a hyperbolic statement, sometimes it felt like he was becoming the Alex Jones of theology. It's just like, it just seems like he was throwing out crazy theories about the election being stolen and just, in many cases, misrepresenting COVID statistics. It just felt like, what is going on? And I don't, who knows? I was trying to wrap my mind around what changed. My main approach was clearly he's going in a different direction. He's going to go his direction. Fine. That's the way it works within Christianity, right? I mean, especially in the Protestant world. He can kind of choose whatever doctrine he wants to go with. Fine. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to move on and go on with my life. You know what? I'm not going to make a big deal about it. Just move on. And I just kind of moved on. A lot of people would email me going, man, what's going on with Dr. James White? And I'd be like, I have no clue, no idea. And, I'm just kind of done and just kind of going to go move on and, pray for the best for him and his ministry. And that's kind of the end. So I didn't really give it much thought. It was just kind of like, okay, well, probably not going to listen to him much anymore. It just seems like something's going on there that I don't get. And, I think maybe I even refer to it as the political hijacking of the American church because I continue to see that. And I kind of moved on. So all of a sudden, late last night, I think it was almost midnight, I'm going through the Edify Christian Podcast app. And I come across a podcast called Theonomy, or Dr. James White and Theonomy. And I'm like, wait, what? Dr. James White and Theonomy. So my first thought was, okay, maybe this is Dr. James White talking about theonomy. Maybe this is Dr. James White debating with someone who holds to theonomy. Maybe what's going on. But when I started listening, I was like, whoa, wait a minute. They're claiming that Dr. James White has now embraced theonomy. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that would explain a lot. Okay, that would explain the change. There was a dramatic change, and that would make sense. He went to Phoenix Reformed Baptist Church that held to the London Baptist Confession of Faith. If he's moved towards theonomy, I think there would be at least some who would say there's no way you can hold to the London Baptist Confession of Faith and embrace theonomy, that the London Baptist Confession of Faith would not allow you to embrace theonomy. Now, I would challenge you to pick up a copy of the London Baptist Confession of Faith and read its chapter on the subject of the law. Read its chapter on the law, and that, what many would argue, is a completely opposite view of the law compared to what is promoted by those who hold to theonomy. So if he has embraced theonomy, if that much is true, then clearly that explains the change. That explains why well, at least it can't explain everything, but it would definitely explain why he went to a church and moved to a church that I don't believe holds to the London Baptist Confession of Faith. So then that would explain a lot. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to take that podcast that I heard last night. We're going to use it really as a starting point to get into a lot of these issues about the law. What should we do? I don't really want to make this about Dr. James White, but what they're going to do, they're going to make it about Dr. James White. I'm not making it about Dr. James White. And I know that there's people out there who argue, there's always this debate, should Dr. James White be referred to as a doctor? Is his doctorate's legitimate? Is his doctorate's degree legitimate, or is it not legitimate? Okay, even under this podcast, I think it was on their YouTube page, there was a big debate over should Dr. James White be considered a doctor or not, and people were debating it. So look, I'm not going to go get into where did he get his doctorates? Is this a legitimate doctorate? I'm not going to get into that right now, because the issue for me is not Dr. James White. I want to make it very clear. What I want to do is use this discussion for a couple of reasons. One, they're going to be playing audio clips of Dr. James White, who clearly seems to be defending and promoting the theonomy view. They're going to be critiquing that. So I'm going to take so what I want to do is you get to hear Dr. James White, you get to hear their critique, and then you get to hear me try to process both sides. So you're really going to get a completely different view than what you would get from hearing Dr. James White by himself, hearing these other guys by themselves, or hearing me by myself. You get to hear all of these different perspectives. I don't want to make this about Dr. James White. Dr. James White's clearly going in a direction that I'm not going, that I'm not following. I don't care. And I don't care if that means, according to him, I'm a heretic. I don't care if that means he thinks somehow there's something wrong with my Christianity. I don't care. I mean, I really don't, because I just disagree with their view. I hold to a view that's very simple, straightforward. I believe things are going to get worse and worse and worse. They're not going to get better. I believe imposing the law upon unregenerate people never ultimately works. I don't want to impose the law of God upon lost people. What I want to do is preach the gospel to lost people. That's what I want to do. And I want to do the best I can to submit to the government as much as possible. I believe there comes a line where I cannot do that, but I want to submit to the government. And the main thing is preach the gospel and live out my Christian life. And I don't want to try to impose Christianity upon lost people. I don't want to try to impose divine law upon other people. That's like Muslims trying to impose Sharia law upon non-Muslims. I don't want that either. I like the freedom for people to be able to worship however they want to worship. Now look, The freedom to worship any way you want to worship is a wonderful freedom. Doesn't mean you're all going to heaven. Doesn't mean it's all going to end in eternal salvation. You have the freedom to worship a false religion. I want the freedom to worship what I believe to be the true religion. I don't want to impose that on anyone else. And I know they'd say, well, the Old Testament would never go with that. I know the Old Testament would never go with that way of thinking. I completely agree. Israel was ruled as a theocracy. And they were to do things according to that. But guess what? I believe the New Testament does not promote that same thinking and that same idea. Nowhere does Paul seem to say, hey, we need to impose divine law upon the government. No, that government, yes, the government may be rebelling against God's law, but I don't think that you should try to get them to follow divine law and impose it. I just go against that. I just think the church's job is to preach the gospel. That's it. Right? Preach and live out our Christian life. In other words, we don't do this and we won't do that. And we won't, yes, we live out our Christian life, but I just don't, I don't go along with this way of thinking. So, Dr. James White, they're going to go in his direction. Apologia is going to do what they do. More power to them. I'm not following that direction. But there are a lot of Christians who don't know what theonomy is, never even heard about these concepts, and they're trying to figure out what to do. They're trying to figure out what to do. And there's a lot, and as society moves further and further away from God, there's going to be so many different approaches different churches take. There's going to be those who are, I'll call it the political hijacking of the church, and it's going to be politics. I reject that. There's going to be some of us who are more like, no, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Just preach and disciple people and live out your Christian life. And it's not through political involvement. It's not through anything else. Others may hold a more theonomy view that we've got to somehow impose God's divine law on society. Everyone's going to have their approach. Others may say, you know what, let's not fight society. Let's compromise and let's go along with their views about LGBTQ. Let's go along with their views about all of these things. That's also going to show up within Christianity. There's going to be all kinds of different approaches. And there's going to be lots of disagreements. What we have to understand is what we need to do is try to understand all the different perspectives. So we're going to try to do a little bit of that this morning, all right? As we are going to listen, this comes from a podcast, I think it's called Particular Baptist is the name of their podcast. And they are going to, they're going to talk a little bit about this. I don't know how much this podcast that we have here queued up is over an hour long. So clearly we're not going to be able to take it all apart, but we're going to use this to at least try to introduce this controversy and just see we're just going to see where it leads us. I've listened to some of this and then I stopped because, I don't like listening to things beforehand. I like my reaction to be real, not rehearsed. But we're going to see how far we can get, and then we'll just see what the reaction is to all of this. All right. But let me make it clear. This is not about Dr. James White. This is about theonomy. This is about law. This is about a society that's moving away from God. What should Christians do? That's the way I want to approach this, all right? So let's see where this goes. Here we go. This comes, again, I'm just going to play their intro. They can introduce themselves, and then you can learn about their podcast, and you can go subscribe to their podcast. And I would recommend you do so. I subscribe to their podcast via the Edify Christian Podcast app. That's how I discovered them. And, let's just let them talk, and let's see what their thoughts are, and then we'll build on this. And it's going to turn into something, as always, we don't ever know where this is ultimately going to end up, but we're going to just let it lead us, and we're going to follow it, and hopefully we're going to have a very interesting conversation. So here we go.
Hello, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. My name is Daniel Vincent, here with my co-host, Sean Cheatham. We are hosted on reformpodcast.com. Please check us and other podcasts out there at reformpodcast.com. But today, we're going to be talking about a controversial topic, very much so, especially in the Reformed world, topic of theonomy / Reconstructionism. And we're going to be doing so in light of a recent Dividing Line episode that Dr. James White did. As many of you probably know, Dr. James White has become a theonomist and post-millennialist. So, but he had done a...
Now let's stop right there. Okay. They say many probably know that Dr. James White has become a theonomist, holding to theonomy, and a post-millennialist. Now, I did a little bit of research, and I think I came across something with Dr. James White basically saying, hey, you can go back this many years and see. So maybe it's nothing new. Maybe it's nothing new. Maybe it's been happening. Again, all I can say is I began to witness the change. And once the change started happening, I started listening less and less and less and less until I was just done. I was just like, you know what, kind of wash my hands of this and move on. Now, maybe I should have kept listening, and then I could have oh, okay, he's embraced theonomy, and I could have realized what was going on. But, at some point, hey, when you're listening to something and every day you're just like, I don't know about that. At some point you just, I'm going to put it this way. There's a million things to listen to, and you got to make your choices. And I can't listen to everything. And sometimes you're just like, I don't want to listen to that anymore. And that's the decision I made. Maybe I should have kept listening and paid attention to what's going on. But he holds to a post-millennial view. All right. If that is true, let me pull something up here. One second here. I'm trying to do this. Here we go. Okay. Post-millennialism. I'm going to try to find, here we go. I'm trying to bring up some simple explanations of what post-millennialism is. Post-millennialism is an interpretation of Revelation chapter 20, which sees Christ's second coming as occurring after the millennium, a golden age or era of Christian prosperity and dominance. The term includes several similar views of the end times, and it stands in contrast to premillennialism, the view that Christ's second coming will occur prior to his millennial kingdom, and that the millennial kingdom is a literal 1,000-year reign, and to a lesser extent, amillennialism, no literal millennialism. So postmillennialism is a belief that Christ returns after a period of time, but not necessarily a literal 1,000 years. Those who hold this view do not interpret unfulfilled prophecy using a normal literal method. They believe that Revelation 20:4-6 should not be taken literally. They believe that 1,000 years simply means a long period of time. Furthermore, the prefix post and postmillennialism denotes the view that Christ will return after Christians, not Christ himself, have established the kingdom on this earth. So theonomy, God's law, needs to be imposed on society. And so postmillennialism is that Christians will rise up and ultimately bring in the kingdom of God on this earth in a golden era where there is Christian dominance. I'm going to tell you, I reject that outright, 1,000%. No, I don't believe that that's ever, no, things are not going to get better. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. There's not going to be a Christian period of Christian dominance where we are ruling and reigning and Christianity is thriving, and then that just ushers in the return of Christ. I completely reject postmillennialism. 1,000%. Look at the world around you. Okay, I can't even believe that anyone in 2021 would even entertain the postmillennial view. I would have thought that would have been rejected. So I look, that's their claim that he's postmillennial. I don't know if that's true. I cannot verify that. If he's postmillennial, because typically Dr. James White was always like he doesn't like eschatology, don't want to discuss eschatology, and kind of moved away from discussions about eschatology. I don't think he even engaged in any debates in regards to topics related to eschatology. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm missing something. But theonomy and postmillennialism, that is a massive departure. I would have, my understanding of the old Dr. James White is he held to an amillennial view, not a postmillennial view. But he never was it wasn't really a major issue with him. But now theonomy and postmillennialism, Wow. Yeah, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot going on there. So we have theonomy, we have post-millennialism. Now, again, forget Dr. James White. He can preach whatever he wants to preach. All right, not focused on that. But it brings in two subjects, theonomy and post-millennialism. That is what we're using this to get us to those topics. That's what we're going to do. Theonomy, post-millennialism, we're going to have to do some far more extensive study and teaching. Maybe I'll have to do some preaching on both concepts. I think it's very important that we do that. That's what I want your focus to be on, not on Dr. White, but on theonomy and post-millennialism. That's where I want you to put your focus. All right, here we go.
Critique or response to someone on Twitter who has spoken against theonomy. And so we're going to play through this entire clip today. It's a little over 16 minutes, so maybe a longer episode today, but we think it's important to play it in its entirety. So we're going to be doing that and going through theonomy. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the concept of theonomy is simply just God's law. Theo meaning God, nomos from the Greek meaning law. So it's God's law. All true Christians believe in theonomy at its basic level in the sense that we believe God's law applies to today. But if you're talking about theonomy from a reconstructionist point of view as a system of belief in terms of how the state is to relate to God's law, etc., that becomes a very different discussion.
Now stop right there. When he says in one basic level, all Christians, in a sense, hold to theonomy, that God's law is applicable, then we could get into antinomianism. Or is someone antinomian? Are they a Christian? Okay, we could get into all of those kind of discussions. I will say this. Everyone knows God's law is in the Bible. All right? Now, what do we do with that law? How is it applicable today? How should it be applied today? And should it be imposed upon society? Those are the deeper questions, right? So there's God's law. And what part of God's law? Ceremonial law? And do we even divide the law up into different categories? Do we take the Old Testament law and break it down into ceremonial law, civil law, and moral law? Do we break it down is that threefold division of the law correct? And if we do break it down into a threefold, well, do we impose ceremonial law? Most would say, no, we don't impose ceremonial law. Okay, so then do we impose the civil laws given to Israel? Some would say, yes, those civil judicial laws should be imposed, and then the moral law should be imposed. All right, so then how does that look in society? How does that look in society? You'd have to go through every moral and judicial law in the Old Testament and say, now make that the law of the land? I mean, do you want to live under that? You could say, well, in some ways it would be great. Are you sure? Look at all the punishments there. And then this would be an important question. Is the Sabbath should be imposed as a civil law? And if someone breaks the Sabbath, should they be killed? This is always, Christians forever have struggled with what to do with the Old Testament law. They really have. And there's all kinds of different systems and ideas. When it comes to theonomy, it's like, so which part of the law do you impose? So yes, I think everyone believes that God's law is applicable in some way today, but applicable in what way? And what way is it applicable? How is it to be used? And well, there's a lot of disagreements about this. All right, let's continue.
And so we're going to be addressing a specific view of God's law as it relates more to the theonomy system of belief. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive into this. Sean, do you have anything to add before we dive in?
Nope, that's good.
All right, so here we go.
Brother Chris.
Can you hear that okay,
made a
Sean?
comment, and I said, I'm going to respond to that. Might as well, because it can be done properly. And I think it's useful. This was back on the 13th. Just made a comment on Twitter. He says, I think the problem with theonomy is that you have unregenerate men attempting to apply and submit others to God's law. It didn't work in Geneva, and I don't believe it would work in America. Well, once again, the issue is what you think theonomy is meaning.
All right, here we go. Now, this is one of the most frustrating things about theology if you've ever been involved in theological studies, gone to seminary, Bible college, or just have theological discussions or debates with people, sometimes it can be so frustrating because you're like, okay, I'm against theonomy. You're like, well, that's not theonomy. Well, I'm against Calvinism. Well, that's not Calvinism. Well, and so there's always, like, whenever you speak against a system, then a lot of times the way the people in that system respond is to say, well, it all depends on what you mean about theonomy. It all depends. So first of all, he's responding to someone who gave a tweet. Let's make it very clear. It's a tweet. Okay, this is why I hate Twitter with every ounce of my being. No theology should ever be discussed on Twitter. Because, see, the minute he sends out a tweet, it's like, well, it all depends on what you mean about theonomy. Well, guess what? In a tweet, he can't explain exactly what he means about theonomy because he's limited to whatever 280 characters, however characters it's limited. I guess he could put one of those a Twitter thread where it's one tweet after another tweet, but then it just becomes a convoluted mess and trying to keep up with what's what. Whatever. Okay, I am not a fan of the whole Twitter thing. It just seems like it destroys meaningful dialogue. Theological dialogue requires space, requires length, requires depth, requires layers. So, all right, but I just want you to know that any discussion about theonomy, any discussion about any theological system, immediately people say, you just don't understand it. You criticize charismatics, you don't understand charismatics. Yeah, it doesn't matter what you talk about. You argue against infant baptism, well, you just don't understand. You just don't it's all you ever hear. If you don't believe what they believe, it's because you don't understand it. You don't get it. You don't really know what it is. And no matter how many years you've spent studying it, no matter how many degrees you may have, it's always like, you just don't get it. Is it possible that I do get it, but still reject it? Is that not a possibility that some people reject it, not because of a lack of understanding, but because they have full understanding, but they still reject it? All right. So I guess he's going to try to explain what theonomy actually is. I guess he's going to try to explain what it actually is. And if he does, then okay. Then look, the main thing is we want to have a discussion about theonomy. So if Dr. White's going to, in a sense, hold to the theonomist view, then we'll let him offer his perspective, and then we'll have these other guys from the particular Baptist podcast offer their critique of that, and then we'll jump in and then try to just turn this into whatever. Clearly, we're going to run out of time quickly, and whenever we run out of time, there's nothing we can do. But we will then pursue this and just see where we end up. And obviously, this is going to turn into a series of podcasts. You know this is going to turn. This has got it written all over. This is going to turn into days and days and days and days of podcasts. Probably a sermon. I'm already upset that I don't think my introduction was done very well, so I apologize for that. But I'm going to have plenty of time to make up for it. All right, here we go.
And I think as more and more people recognize that the church needs to have a strongly prophetic message for the culture, the idea that something like the Noahic covenant is enough, or the idea that the general light of nature, folks, the general light of nature has a father in prison in Canada for trying to save his daughter from the insanity of transgenderism.
So Dr. White is addressing it, kind of going into some covenant theology here as it relates to God's law and the worldview that we should be essentially enlightening the world with. So he says that the Noahic, is the Noahic covenant enough? Is essentially what he's saying. Is the general light of nature enough? Now, what is the Noahic covenant? The Noahic covenant is the covenant that God...
Now, all right, let's stop right here. Now, they jumped in pretty quick with Dr. White there, so I don't really quite know where he's going. They're saying he's somehow referring to the Noahic covenant. I may have missed that, and one of the reasons I'm relying on these guys, I think they may have a better understanding of some of this than I do. So I'm going to try to rely a little bit on them. So the law of nature, I guess what Dr. White is saying is the law of nature or natural God's law written in nature, God's general natural revelation of law is not sufficient. I guess it's kind of where I think you're going, because we have someone in Canada arrested for trying to stop his daughter from LGBTQ, and I don't think I know exactly. I'd have to look up to know exactly which case he's referring to. So I guess he seems to be implying that that is not sufficient enough to stop that from happening. So then if the general law of God that's just kind of written in nature, I guess written on man's heart, if that's not sufficient enough, then I guess what he's going to come along is impose that the church needs a prophetic voice. And that prophetic voice is we proclaim God's law as being needed to be imposed upon society. I guess that's where we're going with this. They jumped in very quick. I wish, part of me, what we may do is go find this actual clip from Dr. White ourselves, and may look at it. Who knows? Well, there's a lot of different directions we can go. But all right, so they're going back to the Noahic covenant. All right, that's just the covenant God made with Noah. All right, that's interesting. That's kind of where they go. Let's see how they unpack this.
God made with Noah in Genesis 8, Genesis 9, where he establishes in creation or with creation, he's never going to flood the earth again. He lays out general principles of how man is to conduct themselves. The death penalty being one of them, that this is how it's going to be for perpetual generations. And so he lays this out, and this is distinct from the Mosaic covenant. This is before God's law was established with Israel, specifically in the ceremonial laws. But the importance of the Mosaic law, the Noahic covenant, is that the Noahic covenant lays out how man is to interact and function apart from any specific religious system or belief. It's essentially a created order covenant, if you will. And it's distinct from that ceremonial law that has specific religious practices or sacrifices. So it lays out how man is to act in general. And David Van Drunen talks about this in his book, Living in God's Two Kingdoms, a biblical vision for Christianity and culture. He lays this out, what the Noahic covenant is. So if you're using the Noahic covenant as an argument against theonomy, I think it can be very strong because the Noahic covenant does lay out specific created ordinances that are distinct from any particular religious covenant, like that have to do with circumcision, atoning for sin, etc. And so I think that's very helpful, and I don't think this is a very good critique on Dr. White's part. And then he talks about the general light of nature. It almost seems like, and Sean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like Dr. White is moving away from general revelation and focusing more on special revelation. Well, we need to have a prophetic word. We need to have this word from God that's going to establish what a worldview is. And we would say, yes, if we want to flesh out that worldview, absolutely. But the general light of nature is very important when we're talking about man's standing before God, his guilt before God. Romans 1 and Romans 2 make it very clear that we have the law of God written on our hearts. We know God's law apart from the scriptures being revealed. And we even know things in the created order that we are not supposed to do. Paul talks about homosexuality as a twisting of God's created order. And he lists other sins as well. But he also says that those who do such things know that they know that those who do such things deserve to die. They know the penal punishment for those sins. They also know what they're not supposed to do. And that comes from the general light of nature. They have the law of God written on their hearts. They have the law of God revealed in creation, who God is, and that he's to be worshipped. And so when they turn away from that, they're suppressing that. This is before they even have gotten to the scriptures or any kind of worldview being given to them. So right away, this view that we have to somehow present this worldview to man, either in addition to the light of nature, as if he's not going to know it without the scriptures, is not what Paul teaches. It's not what Paul teaches at all. So we have to be very careful when we're talking about the general light of nature. It does condemn, and God's law is there. God's law is there. And when we're talking about theonomy, we're not talking about whether God's law should be applied today or not. It's how God's law should be applied today. That's really the issue. So God's law is there, written on the hearts of man. It's given to us through creation and revealed through that. And it's more specifically revealed in the scriptures. But what God has revealed in nature and through conscience is enough to condemn them. So general light of nature is certainly enough in terms of condemning man, and certainly of convicting him of sin. That foundation is already there.
Okay, this kind of goes in a direction that I wish they would have just allowed. I don't know. I was hoping it would be a little. Maybe this is going to probably become more helpful. I mean, they go for an hour and 30 minutes, so it probably will become more helpful. I will say this: God's law, this idea that God's law is written on the heart, God's law is kind of revealed and kind of, I guess, natural law. It's just kind of there, and it's enough to condemn people. Okay, yes, Theonomy, I think, would argue, but it may condemn people, but clearly, put it this way. Let me state it this way. Clearly, God's law written on the heart, God's law in nature, has been there forever, and people have rebelled against it. That's because of the depravity in the human heart. They're always going to rebel against it. So the issue is, then what do we do about that rebellion against God's law? Then do we say, okay, well, here's the law that's kind of in nature, but it's not sufficient enough to keep everyone acting and doing the right thing. So then we have to impose a different law, a law of government, a law of society upon the people to keep them in check and to make them act right. That, to me, seems to be the question. I would say that the general law condemns them, right? Reveals that they are a sinner. It demonstrates that they are a sinner. It demonstrates that there's something wrong in them. And the solution is not imposing a divine law upon society. The solution is preaching the gospel to them. See, you are condemned by God's law. You are guilty. Here is the solution. It's the gospel. I don't believe the solution to that rebellion is then for an additional law. I think that is really the issue. But let's see how they continue to try to articulate this.
So it almost seems like he's saying, well, we need this. We need the scriptures in order to show that world. You don't. The cannibal in the jungle is going to be condemned because he twists God. He worships idols that are other than God, and he suppresses that truth that he knows in his conscience through the law of God written on his heart. And the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, in the chapter on religious worship in the Sabbath days, chapter 22, the first part of the first paragraph says, "The light of nature shews that there is a God who hath lordship and sovereignty over all, is just, good, and doth good unto all, and is therefore to be feared, loved, praised, called upon, trusted in, and served with all the heart and all the soul and all the might." Now notice that language at the end, with all the heart and all the soul and with all the might. What is that? That is required? That Jesus said that's the first table of the law, right? Or that's the first and greatest commandment, right? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then loving your neighbor as yourself is the other part of that. It's summing up the law, right? So God's law is still here. God's law is still active. It still condemns. But we have to be very careful we don't move away from that. And he appears to be moving away from the general light of nature as being an important aspect of God's revelation to man. And Sean, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
So I'll definitely, at the very least, add, because he's very focused in this clip on basically getting the cultural decay. Jackson commented. Jackson's a friend of ours. Stopping the cultural decay that's currently going on.
Yep.
And the only point I would like to make is, if the light of nature is not enough, and if the Noahic covenant's not enough, if people are going to ignore that, what makes you think that they're all then going to obey the judicial law? It's the law is not able to get people to be righteous. They need to be regenerated in order for that to happen. And Dr. White made a comment or a statement there that I want to spend a little time talking about. He said that the people are waking up to the fact that the church needs a strongly prophetic message for the culture. Now, Dan, if I were to go to you and tell you this church has a strong prophetic message for the culture, what would you think I was referring to?
I would probably, well, if you say prophetic, it probably sounds more like Pentecostal in nature to some extent.
Well, I heard that, and I immediately thought, well, yes, the church does have a strong prophetic word for the culture. It's called the gospel.
Right.
We do. So it's very bizarre to hear that, and then to hear him go on and talk about the Noahic covenant and such. Because as we'll go through this clip, it'll become obvious that this prophetic word that he thinks the culture needs to hear so much about is you need to keep God's law, and then you'll be blessed. Essentially, the nation needs.
All right, I think I see what's happening here. They didn't let Dr. White go very long because they've already heard the clip. So they just like immediately jumped in, and because they already know where the clip is going, they're already addressing that which Dr. White has yet to mention in the clip that they played. That's always that's one of the dangers of listening to the clip first, is because you already know where it's going. So you start making comments about something that hasn't even been said yet, because in your mind, you've already heard it. So that's why one of the reasons I don't do that, I listen to it in real time. So therefore I can only respond to what I've heard. Now, the danger of doing it my way is you respond to what you think they're saying, and then 3 seconds later, 5 seconds later, 20 seconds later, you're like, oh, okay, wait a minute. Never mind. Okay, I thought that's where they were going, but they're not. And it seems like that they're already addressing things Dr. White is going to say. They're not necessarily addressing the things that he has said, because they only let him speak for just a couple of, I don't even think that was a minute. And then they're like, Noahic covenant. I'm like, wait a minute. Did he even mention the Noahic covenant? Like, how did we get there? So it's really, I think that's kind of what's happening here. I want to get us to a good stopping point here. But the two things you need to write down: theonomy, post-millennialism. All right. The societal decay, and what should we do about it? The society increasingly moving away from God's law. What should we do about that? I think that is what we're trying to establish here. Okay, is things going to get worse, or is things going to get somehow because of the Christians? There's going to be a golden era where Christians basically dominate society, and it's going to usher in a Christian golden era that will then bring in the kingdom of God, and that we as Christians are basically to help establish the kingdom of God on earth. That to me is not what I'm called to do. I don't see that. I don't understand it that way at all. But again, I don't know. Is Dr. White going to mention post-millennialism in this clip? That would be very interesting if he does. Well, let's see if we can bring this to a good stopping point.
To keep God's law, and then they'll be blessed. And that is not the word that we need to be given right now. We need to be giving.
There's no gospel discussion in this video that I heard.
There's not. No, there's not. And I know James White knows the gospel. I've heard him say it multiple times. Absolutely. This is not us saying that he doesn't have the gospel. But one thing I have noticed with theonomists is in a lot of their presentation, the gospel actually gets lost, and it becomes a focus on law.
Okay, now you see why I asked the questions that I asked at the beginning. All right, let me go back and ask the questions, all right? What should Christians do when society increasingly moves away from God and His law? Should Christians focus on the preaching of the gospel and living out our Christian life, or should Christians look to impose the law of God on society? They're claiming that for many theonomists, the focus, and that doesn't mean that they deny the gospel or stop preaching the gospel, the focus seems to become on law, or I will argue law, politics, cultural issues, and not the preaching of the gospel. That I think, and that, to me, that's the change I've seen in Dr. White. When did it become so political? Why is he making these comments? That, I think that explains it, and that's the possible problem with theonomy. Now, just because that would not be a sufficient reason to say theonomy is not true simply because it can lead to this problem. Some will argue that believing in eternal security can lead to a problem of people not caring about sin. But that doesn't disprove the doctrine. The doctrine can still be true, but there can be problems that arise from how people handle the doctrine. So I'm not making an argument for or against theonomy right now. I'm clearly telling you I reject it because I look at it from a completely different perspective. But just saying that some people then become so focused on the law that they downplayed the gospel is not a sufficient grounds to say theonomy is not true. It just shows you that there's a possible problem that can arise from that doctrine. But there's a possible problem that can arise from pretty much any doctrine, all right? So, but the problems that arise from the doctrine does not negate the truth of the doctrine, if that makes sense. All right, here we go.
And that's not good, and that's a major critique, a major issue we have. When we go before the civil magistrate and say you're doing unrighteous things, do we leave it there? Do we say you're doing unrighteous things, you need to stop so that God will not judge you? Or do we then present the gospel to that person? We need to present the gospel to anybody. It doesn't matter who they are, whether it's a civil magistrate or not. And it's that gospel, not always, I don't want to say always, but it seems to me that a lot of time that gospel message gets lost. And that is the core. That is the core reason why we need, the core thing that we need to be bringing out.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Sean. There is an overemphasis on the here and now as opposed to the gospel. The gospel is not enough to change the culture. And we do believe, and I'll say this again, we as true Christians believe the law of God applies for today. We believe it does. It's how it applies that's the issue. Are we taking all of the judicial laws of the Old Testament and applying them for today, or are we taking the general equity of them? That's really the substance here. And where do we break up God's law? How does the scriptures lay out how God's law is to be applied in different ways? So the church versus the state. That's the real discussion that has to be had here. And unfortunately, at least from the apologia side, it seems that our theonomist brothers don't make that distinction. And it's just you either agree with me or you hate God's law. That seems to be the fundamental issue. But the gospel is not talked about as much as it should be. The gospel is what changes the heart. The gospel is what brings salvation. That's the power of God to salvation. It's not a power of God to salvation. It's the power of God to salvation. It's what Paul says in Romans 1. So that has to be front and center when we're engaging the nations and we're engaging the culture. The gospel has to be the center. Yes, God's law in a moral and general equitable sense applies to the state. No true Christian denies that. But we have to make sure that the gospel, which changes the heart and causes people to truly submit to God's law, is front and center. And that's where I think part of our disagreement is.
All right, we're going to have to stop there. They didn't get very far into this. I know that. I wanted to get much further, but I have so much going on. I have a discussion going on here on my iPad with people talking about the famous verse in 1 Corinthians about if anyone's in Christ, he's a new creature, old things pass away, behold, all things have become new. And it sparked a debate because obviously you know how I interpret that verse. So I got that going on here on my iPad. While that's going on, then I'm trying to listen to this clip and I'm trying to figure out, okay, we didn't get near as far as I wanted to get. So we got 14 minutes. You hear that? We got 14 minutes and 36 seconds into this. So I need to grab a notebook here. 14 minutes and 36 seconds. That's how far. You hear that? All those notifications happening? Yeah, that discussion is getting very interesting. So I'm going to have to go engage in that discussion in a minute. All right, 14 minutes and 36 seconds. So where do we didn't get very far, but I want you to write down the word theonomy, look up some definitions of theonomy, post-millennialism, make sure you know those two views, and then ask yourself, ultimately, when society is moving away from God, what is the solution? Do you want to impose God's law on society? Now, listen, you may say, yes, you do, right? You may want to say, yes, you do. But what happens when Christianity becomes the minority and loses that power? Then another religion comes and imposes their religion upon everyone in society. So if Christians... And again, I mean, the church is losing its influence by the second. People are leaving churches in larger and larger numbers. I just think you're out of your mind to think that we're going to usher in some theonomy idea of imposing the divine law on the people. It's not going to happen. So I just think it's an exercise in futility even considering it. It's never going to happen. It's not going to happen. Things are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. I stand by that completely. Just from the time that I became a Christian in the 1980s to 2021, give me a break. Things are not getting better. You're out of your mind if you think they are. Okay, yeah, like something is seriously wrong at that point. Okay, so things are not going to get better. So I think the reason I've never really got into much of a debate with theonomy is, I'm like, okay, well, you go with that. It's never going to work. It's never going to happen. Fine. And my thing is, even if you got it to work, well, as soon as Christianity loses that power, then next thing you know, Muslims are imposing their power. Or is it wrong for them to? Well, of course it's wrong because it's not God's law. The point is you're establishing the idea that religious law should become societal law, which I know that theonomy and theocracy, and I think typically people say there's a major distinction, but it sounds very much like you want a theocracy imposed. Well, then so is it just God's law? Or do you bring in so you bring in divine law? And again, I have to ask the question, if you bring in and impose divine law, does penalties of false doctrine become civil law? And the reason I ask that is because which Christian group gets to impose the divine law? Do Catholics get to impose divine law? Do Protestants get to impose divine law? Which Protestants? Baptist? Presbyterians? So if you're Presbyterian and you're imposing it, then do you punish the Baptists who won't baptize babies and deny that that's a legitimate baptism? Like, how far do you take this? Or just basic civil, there's so many questions. And I know that they were saying, well, you're just asking foolish questions. No, I'm asking legitimate questions. I am so... Oh, I'm interested to see where this all goes. Well, we just got to stop that now because, man, we did not get anywhere close to where I wanted to get. I apologize for the kind of sloppy intro. I do apologize. I could have done better. But I was really trying to figure out how to get us to where I wanted it to get us. And I think asking those basic questions were okay. I could have phrased them a little differently, but I'm just going to leave it there. And then I cannot wait to see how people react to all of this. newsif@yahoo.com, newsif@yahoo.com. We're definitely going to be talking about this more. We're going to definitely we're probably going to pull out a lot of random podcasts and sermons from a theonomist point of view to let them try to articulate their view. And because that's what I always tend to do is okay, let's say you're right. Now go ahead and explain your position. Now let's take it to its logical conclusion and see where we end up. But we'll work through the rest of this clip. I mean, we didn't make it very far into it. We made it. I say, let's consider this. I've been speaking now for 1 hour and 12 minutes, and we listened to only 14 minutes of their clip. So we didn't use a lot there, but at least we got started. All right, we'll stop right there. Everyone have a great day. God bless.